Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Industrial Real Estate Show. I am pleased to be joined by Ned from 9606 Capital, where we're going to talk about IOS. Ned, before we even get into it, thanks so much for joining me on the call.
Thanks for having me here, Chad. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we had a little bit of a chat beforehand. It wasn't even called iOS when you got into it. When you said 2014, is that when you bought the first property?
2014 is when I first got into it and had multiple names. Truck parking, container storage, trailer yard, cross dock facilities. It didn't really get named, I believe, until like 2021.
Yeah, that's when I seem to recall it growing in popularity. Everyone's like, "Well, is that the operating system for iPhones, or what is iOS?" And then all of a sudden, it's this big category now out of nowhere. So yeah, very fascinating to do it. What got you into to consider that in the first place? Going back to 2014, 11 years now.
So I actually helped a friend who had a freight or logistics company. Helped them. He asked me to help him find a property that had a smaller building that had a smaller footprint with a property that had a larger piece of land that he could store park trucks and trailers on. And I said, "Piece of cake, I'll help you find it." And then when I started searching throughout the market, I realized that it was very difficult to find a property where it's smaller building with a larger piece of land. When I found the building that fits, the land was very small. And when I found the piece of land that fits, the building was way too large. So I found something that was probably about four times the size, land and the building, what he needed. And when I talked to him about it, he's like, "Hey, maybe I can lease out some of the space." And I said, "Okay, let me put together renderings. It'll take a few weeks. We'll put together a plan and renderings, and I'll get it back to you." Well, he calls me the following week, and he's like, "I got three other tenants. They're ready to sign leases." And I said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! We don't even have the renderings, let alone we're not even hard on the contract." So it kind of got me to realize that there was a real demand for these properties, and it was sub asset class that nobody was talking about at the time, and that's what first got me interested.
So do you think there was some analyst or someone out there that said this is a sleeping giant, but we can't explain it, so we need to give this a name? So a think tank perhaps got together and said, "Okay, iOS is what it is. Now we have a name for it. Now we can identify it." And I guess that question leads to how has it changed now in 10 years from when you bought the first one, where nobody was talking about iOS, as like you said, yard or truck yard or industrial land, to where it is today in 2025?
So to answer your question about the naming, I'm not exactly sure how it came about, but there were few names floating around because different companies try to brand it. Some companies called it industrial outside storage. Some companies called it industrial service facilities. And I believe that iOS just kind of like became popular, whether it was like more people were talking about it.
Hmm.
And that's kind of, what happened and it got stuck. But to talk about what changes happened, it's a tremendous change. It went from an undesirable stepchild to one of the most desirable, sub asset classes in all of real estate industry today. If you talk about industrial and iOS, very desirable. If you're talking about maybe multifamily, it's very desirable. It's unlike office or retail that's on its decline, right? So it went from, I think one of the things that affected it is that office really was impacted negatively, and the money that was allocated for the office had to go somewhere. This was a new child, and a lot of the capital started moving moving their allocations from the office to this new child. But things that changed are multiple. For example, when I first started buying assets, banks didn't understand it. That they're like, "What is this? A piece of dirt? With like this little rinky-dinky building on it. We don't know how to appraise it. We don't understand the rental comps." So for majority of the assets early on, I had to put up personal guarantees. Luckily, I have a fairly sizable balance sheet and a healthy balance sheet with assets that have good global cash flow. So the banks were willing to give it to me, right? But it was very difficult to finance properties, and banks, insurance companies, they didn't understand it. Also, there was no liquidity in the market.
Hmm.
The reason why I got into it is it wasn't to like buy, stabilize, and then sell for a good cap rate and create spread, I got into it because I was like, hey, this is a great cash flow asset. When I got into it, the rates were probably about, 5%. You could stabilize an asset at 12% yield on cost, or people like to call it cap. And, your cash flow was like 17, 18, 20% a year. So I'm like, look, in 5, 6 years, I get my money back and I still have this asset that there's not a whole lot that you have to do with it. It's not like a big industrial warehouse where, tenant moves out after 20 years, then you have to redo the roof, and you have to redo the parking lot, and you have these big expenditures coming out. All you maybe do is you just add more gravel and, fix up the fence. But many things have changed. There was no liquidity. You couldn't sell assets. There was no way there was no buyer. So now, many banks are familiar with the asset class. You can get appraisals. I believe there's still some lack of transparency when it comes to rents, the rental comps. There's still a lot of confusion. Even the people that pretend to know it don't know it. And it's hard to know it if you've only been in the industry for 2 years, right? Meaning, if you only have 2 or 3 years of data, it's kind of hard to tell what's true and what's not. We have about 10 or 11 years. And I can give you an example of that. So financing is different. There's a lot more capital in it. Larger companies are starting to recognize it. They understand the need. So you have better tenants. And they're definitely institutional, at first, investment advisors like JP Morgan Chase, Blackstone, BlackRock got into the business. And now you're seeing pension funds with core plus funds coming in. So it's really like, I would say it's probably about 85% fully institutionalized. The one thing I can compare it to is probably about self-storage about 10 years ago, where self-storage used to be 85% fragmented, meaning 85% of the market was owned by mom and pop. For industrial outside storage, it's still the case. So we still have probably about 5, 6 years of runway until that becomes completely institutionalized.
Yeah, it's got to be two unique asset classes in that regard, is that they have traditionally always been mom and pop. And maybe that's a misnomer, because it could have just been a small or a local investor that just happens to own one of these, but it certainly wasn't institutionalized. It was foreign to a lot of lenders. A lot of people poorly understood it. Self-storage was interesting how quickly that institutionalized, and even iOS, considering it was just coined 4 or 5 years ago as a term, to have it all of a sudden start attracting institutional money is fascinating as well. Are you still finding, so if it's still a large percentage of ownership being under the mom and pop, are you finding that they're coming around to the value of their property and saying, okay, well, if there's all this institutional money chasing us, we need to start raising our prices? Or are you still finding that there's opportunities to buy properties where the owners don't fully understand what they're sitting on?
Well, I'll kind of try to answer the first part of your question, right? Where you touched on, well, actually, look, let me touch the second part. I'm going to answer your second part, which was, are there still opportunities where the sellers don't understand what they're sitting on? I would say there are. When we speak to the potential sellers, we make sure they do understand what they're sitting on. We don't want to, wing someone and take advantage of somebody who doesn't know what they're selling and make the money that way. The way we see ourselves is we approach owner operators who are majority owners. And that was the first part of your question. You said maybe there were some investors, smaller investors. We don't see any investors early on. What we see are the people who had a business, like a truck repair shop, pallet, factory, maybe a trucking business, and they needed space for their own business. And because there wasn't an industry, they actually ended up buying the property for very cheap. So ended up owning the property and using their own property. So those are, I would say, we don't deal with like investors who own these properties. Now you can find them, but early on they were not there, right? So they're really owner operators. And what we find is a lot of the owner operators are older people, baby boomers who are looking to retire. What we find is that a lot of them are still working because they have this unspoken fear that if I do sell my property, okay, I'm going to get some cash. And then what's going to end up happening to me is, I'm going to have this cash and maybe I have it for 5, 7, 10 years and then I'll spend it. And then I'll end up dying old, very old and poor, which is a scary thought, right? Especially in the United States, where you don't have all these social things and governments taking care of you. So what we do differently than most companies is we approach the owners, we build a relationship with them, we find out, you know, what is their desired life? What is the goal in their life? Do their kids want the business? If their kids are capable and willing to take it over, which most times they're not, we'll help the kids find a tenant. We may charge a leasing commission for it, but we'll help them find a good tenant. We'll help them manage the property. We'll give them access to our network and our platform. Most of the times they don't want it. So what we do is I have accounts with JP Morgan Private Wealth and Goldman Sachs. I introduce them to really good wealth planners that otherwise wouldn't work with these owners. And they give them real tax planning, wealth planning. And then if it makes sense for them to sell the property, have a good tax plan on the exit, and they can take that cash, invest it, replace their current cash flow, and have the money until they pass and maybe leave something off for their kids as well. And in exchange for that, we tell them, look, you're getting certain value. We recognize the value of the property. We are going to add additional value to it. We're going to improve it. We're going to bring in a new tenant that's going to pay a lot more rent. So you can't get all the upside. We cannot get all the upside. Let's find a balance where it works for both of us. And we find that when you treat people with dignity and you actually take care of your sellers, you get more referrals and you get better deals, rather than trying to kind of be out there and try to find people who don't know what they're selling and taking advantage of that opportunity.
I love it. I think I'm so happy that you described it that way, because I think there is that misconception out there that the institutional money that's coming into the sector is all private equity. And when you think private equity, you think people that are just trying to exploit opportunities, and they might go and try and find someone that doesn't realize what they're sitting on and try to take advantage of the situation. So I love the fact that you guys are educating them on what it's worth, because I agree there's lots of ways to make money in this world, and taking advantage of an unsuspecting person, whether it's an elderly person or just someone that doesn't really understand what they are, I think is the worst way to make money. So love how you said that. I can see why you guys are having the success that you are on that. When you are trying to come up with that value, how do you approach it? So let's just say someone has a 10-acre site, and it's, so like you said, it's a truck repair company. They bought it 20 years ago, and they needed a small shop, but they needed to have parked vehicles on there. So they've got a 10-acre site, and any market that you can think of, if you have one that comes to mind. But how would you approach saying, here's what this property is actually worth?
So what we'll typically do is we'll take a look at the market. We're in top 30 markets in United States, top 30 industrial markets in US. And we have comps in these markets, not all of them starting 11 years ago, but all of them starting 7 years ago. So some 11, but let's call it Chicago is where we started. And we have 11 years of data. Or, Atlanta, we started 9 years ago, and Florida, same thing 9 years ago. So we have 9 years of data. What we found, for example, and I'll digress a little bit, then I'll get back on the point. What we found, for example, is in 2022 and 2023 in Atlanta, a lot of people were buying these lots, and they were being told that the rent by brokers, and there were a few comps out there, not a lot of them, but there were a few comps supporting rents of $8,000 to $10,000 a month an acre. Well, we started in Atlanta, 6 years prior to that date. So we saw the rents go from $1,200 a month an acre to $1,500 a month an acre to $1,800 a month an acre. And then 6 months prior to that new rental comp, we were looking at like $4,000 a month an acre. So when people started talking about $8,000 or $9,000 or $10,000 a month an acre, we said, there's no chance. Like the rents didn't double, more than double in 6 months. There's some kind of mispricing situation here. And some people, unfortunately, ended up buying assets based on, stabilizing at that rate. And now they can't lease them. There's some vacancy. The vacancy is not there because there's not a user for the site. It's just that there's not a user at that price, right? So I would say today's price, depending on which part of Atlanta, there's different submarkets, but let's call it like generally like, $5,000 a month an acre. So we would say it's $5,000 a month an acre. If this property was fully stabilized, today it would sell for, call it 7% cap rate, right? And then you have some selling expenses. And we would tell the owner, okay, but the property needs improvements. Okay. It needs to be leased. It needs to be stabilized. So if we're going to call it partner, or if we're going to buy this property from you, we cannot pay you 7% cap on the future rent.
Mhm.
We need a little bit of a discount. So maybe we get 100 to 120 basis points discount, or maybe 150 basis point discount on what needs to be done. So if we're going to spend the money, do the improvements, we'll put that in the calculation. We'll take the stabilized rent. We'll put in some vacancy, 6 months or 8 months of vacancy, depending on the market. Atlanta is probably sitting on 6 to 8 months vacancy if you have the right pricing. So we'll price in the vacancy, and then we'll say, look, when we stabilize this asset, we can sell it to 7 yield on cost, but we're doing all of this work. We're finding the tenant, we're taking the risk. So we need 150 basis point discount. So we'll buy it based on 8.5 cap stabilized price, and you can sell it to us as is. So, and if the, seller wants to do all the work themselves, they're more than, we can even help them with certain parts. We can help them lease it. We can help them improve it. Most times people don't want to go down this rabbit hole because it's a lot of work, a lot of resources, and we have a team of 30 people to execute. So it's a lot easier to do it, when you have a team and you have an established, and also we're taking the risk. If the property doesn't lease for the amount that we projected, then it's our problem. If the construction budget turns out to be more, it's our problem, right? So being transparent with the owner and saying like, hey, you're going to capture this much money, but we're going to do all this work and we're going to capture a little bit more on top, I believe makes everybody happy.
Yeah, and that transparency is key and can't be understated because I think a lot of times there isn't that communication that goes back and forth between a buyer and a seller. It's just, here's the price, here's what we're willing to pay, take it or leave it kind of thing. Whereas having that discussion and that dialogue and showing everything, here's what it's going to look like when it's finished. Here's all the work that we have to do. You can do this too, but there's, like you said, having the experience and a 30-person team, there's a value on that I think a lot of people appreciate. You mentioned earlier that you're in the top 30 markets in the US. Is that by choice? Is that by just where the opportunities have come? And I guess I'd say that if there's somebody listening right now that has a property in a tertiary or secondary market that wouldn't be in one of those top 30 markets, is that something that you explore, or are you only focused on those top 30 markets by choice?
So we have the way we deploy capital currently, and that we have, we didn't start this way, but in 2014 we started portfolio one, 2021 we started fund two, and then last year or beginning of this year we started fund three. So what we do is, like, I'm a large limited partner. I'm the largest limited partner in the group. We also have some other families, operators, and institutional players that come into the fold as well. We pull the money together in a fund. So the fund has the first opportunity. So as far as like our risk tolerance, I believe there are enough opportunities in the primary and secondary markets for this type of capital. We do have some sidecars, meaning if something doesn't fit the fund criteria, fund has the first right of refusal on everything we do. If the fund denies it, we do have some investors who may be interested in a secondary or tertiary market that's maybe close to them, or they have other interests. They live in Jacksonville, and they like Jacksonville, but they don't mind moving towards, Lakeland. Like, for example, Lakeland's not a primary market. So they would say, hey, I'm committed maybe $2 million in the fund, but I have another allocation of 5 million for secondary or tertiary. So we do have that as well, but our primary focus is on our primary business. And also, if we're not interested in a tertiary market, we're happy to help others. We help other people and give them advice, and like most of the stuff, unless they're asking us to do a lot of work, for like a 15-minute conversation on how to do something, I'll do it free, right? Or one of our team members can help them, because we want to build up, reputation of somebody who's honest, honorable, executes. We're very profitable, but because we're elevating people's lives, we're getting a good outcome for the seller, we're getting a really good outcome for our investors and ourselves, and we're getting a great outcome for our end buyer, which is typically a pension fund, and you want to have, for them, they don't want to buy one asset. They want to buy a portfolio that's diversified nationally or regionally, right? They want a well-diversified portfolio, not only geographically, but also by the different types of tenants.
Mhm.
So we have different buckets. So I wouldn't, if we say no to something, we can say no, but then either like we can help or we say, hey, here's a company that does it.
Yeah, well said. Love the strategy that you guys have on that, and even just in the short amount of time that we've talked, I get the real genuine sense that you guys are earnest in that endeavor. So I applaud you for that. What do you
Thank
look
you.
for? What is a good site? What's so something that comes across your desk that excites you? Is it specific size, specific area, specific tenant in mind? Is it just is because even iOS? Actually, let me back up and even make this even real simple because I've heard iOS described still as a lot of things. I tend to think of it as a building with less than 10% site coverage ratio. Do you have any rules of thumb on that on how you look at an iOS property, or do
It
you
could,
try to
it
get
could be
more?
less than 10, it could be less than 20, depending on, it could be like a large cross dock facility, right? That it could be a large cross dock that is still an iOS site. So depending on the situation, if it's an industrial building in the middle of the lot and it's 20% and the rest of the land is not usable, then it's definitely not an iOS. But like if you have the building in a corner and you have a large lot that's open, I would say it's iOS. It's under 10 is usually works all the time, but under 20 could potentially work as well, depending on the layout.
Yeah, yeah, great point on that. So, do you have a preference? Do you like having bare land, or do you like having some property on there, or is that market specific and deal specific?
It's market specific, deal specific. In today's market, I'll generalize. It may or may not be true, right? So we'll look at anything, but well, I'll generalize. We like a little bit of building, right? Meaning it could be 3,000 square feet, 5,000, 10,000, 15, 20, up to 50, right? And then lots that are 3 to 20, 25 acres. We just purchased one in Atlanta that's 78 acres. So there's not exactly like this, the least amount. And what we really love doing is when we're speaking to the potential seller who's, let's say, not in a big rush, right? And we're finding out the value. We've had this happen multiple times where we make a deal with the seller to say, like, hey, we'll sign a contract, we'll go through the due diligence, but then they'll give us, let's say, another 3 or 4 months to find a tenant,
Hmm.
right? So then we don't have to discount any rents. And if we find a tenant with those 3 or 4 months, we'll say, okay, well, here's what the tenant's going to pay in rent, right? We'll take a little bit of a discount, less of a discount than we would normally, and then we'll give you the cash. Um, Outside of that, if we don't find the tenant, we'll still buy the asset and we have a predetermined price. So the seller knows their like minimum price they're going to get. But if we find the tenant that's going to willing to pay more rent, then they can actually even make more money. And we're very happy to show them like, hey, here's the lease that we're signing with the tenant. And give them a calculation ahead of time. And I think it actually works for both sides. The the seller can get more money, right? And we de-risk portion of it prior to buying an asset. So it's like a win-win situation. But I mean, outside of that, we'll look at any site. We're well capitalized. And what's unique with us, because we started buying assets 10 years ago, I know some people are talking about financing stuff. And there's one major thing that's changed with the banks in the last 2 years. Prior to 2 years ago, if you go to finance a deal, the bank would ask you for all the financials on that deal. Today, the banks are asking for the global statement of cash flows. Our global cash flow is our debt service coverage ratio is like 2.6.
Well,
The banks require 1.25.
mhm.
So if we're buying an asset and they ask for global cash flow, we send it to them. And then they're very, oftentimes we talk to the banks and they say, well, we're not financing now. So we'll tell them like, well, take a look at this deal and maybe in the future when you guys start, financing, we can talk. And then we send them our global cash flow and our financials. Then they call back and say, well, you guys seem legit. So, you know, because they know even if there's no tenant there, well, we can afford to take on, equal amount of properties that we have now, like double our portfolio size, not getting any rent on those properties and still carry the 1.25 DSCR, right? So it kind of depends. It's putting operators who are well stabilized in a good position. So we're well capitalized. So we're looking at a lot of opportunities, and whatever we don't want, we give a quick no and a reason why not.
Yeah, you're the rare combo of a buyer that isn't going to have issues with financing, but is still going to be honest and truthful with the sellers. So I think for anyone that is concerned that they're going to get taken advantage of, or they're going to do the dance with a buyer and only to find out that they can't close or get the proceeds, I think you check a lot of those boxes. What does a spec look like for you on a site? And you mentioned that 78-acre site. Are you going in, or are you putting gravel down on all of that and fencing it and putting lights, or what does a typical improvement look like for you when you buy a site?
So we bought a site, rezoned it to have it industrial. We didn't close on it until we rezoned it. The owners were willing to sit on the land and get a higher price for us to get the zoning. So we got the zoning for heavy industrial. Not only we get heavy industrial zoning, we got special use permit in addition to heavy industrial. We did not need it, but we got it like for extra belt and suspenders. So we can use it for truck parking, container storage, fleet storage, auto salvage yard. We listed a lot of uses that it could be used for, because we didn't want the municipality or government to change and then they come back and say, well, our zoning code doesn't allow for that. So even though it's zoned correctly, we like to get a special use. And what we're doing on this site, it's 78 acres. It's 39 usable. Okay, so we've already stabilized. When I say stabilized, we're leveling, graveling, fencing, lighting. And also in addition to doing all of that, we are getting 10,000 square foot maintenance shops or like small cross-dock facilities approved to be built, right? Meaning we're getting approvals, but we're not building them. So if a tenant comes in and says, hey, I need 10,000 square feet or 7,000 square feet with a 2,000 square foot office, we can order a metal shop and have it delivered in 4 or 5 months. If the tenant wants the land and they want to use it, we don't need to build it. So why should the tenant pay more rent for a building that we spent $1 million on or $1.2 million on that they don't need? And if the tenant needs it, usually these larger companies, a matter of 3 months or 4 or 5 months waiting to get something delivered is not a big deal.
Yeah, well said. Another question that's probably very difficult to answer, because I'm sure this will also vary across different markets and scale. But do you have a rough price per acre on what it costs to go in and take a site from just raw land to putting the gravel on there, fencing it, and lighting it? Do you have any like rough rules of thumb that you use?
It's market by market.
Hmm.
It's market by market. And I'll give you some rough numbers. So I believe, for example, like in Jacksonville, depending on how much grab, it's a tough, but like I'll probably be mispricing it. Call it Jacksonville. By the time you put in, if you're doing it right, you're putting detention ponds, you're grading, you're cutting some trees, you're grading it, you're removing the topsoil, you're adding gravel, fencing, lighting, you're probably looking at about $225,000 an acre. If you're looking at the same site in Chicago, you can probably get it done for $125,000 an acre. Now, in Jacksonville, there are no quarries. Okay, so the price of gravel is $800 a truck delivered, right? And in Chicago, millings are the same way. Recycled asphalt millings are basically priced the same way. Well, for example, for the same type of scope in Chicago, gravel is a lot less. But in Chicago, you're allowed to use, or Chicagoland area, you can use a little bit of gravel underneath, and you can add a lot of recycled asphalt on top, which is actually better, in my opinion, because it's dust proof, right? It doesn't, like
Hmm.
as you're driving on it, there's not dust flying up. It's dust proof, and also like as it settles and the sun hits it, it becomes very, very stable. Um, we were able to negotiate deals with different union contractors that resurface the roads during the summer. When they're resurfacing the roads, they remove it, and instead of paying a $50 dumping fee, okay, to dump the goods, we give them $30 a truck for them to deliver it to our sites. right? So now instead of paying $800 a truck in Jacksonville, we're getting the trucks for $30 a truck, full truckloads. So it just depends market by market, situation by situation. But I would say, if you have light work to do, probably about 75 to 125. Heavier duty work, you're looking at, 175 to $300,000 an acre, depending where you're at.
That's such a great answer, and I think that underscores just the importance of having not just local market intelligence, but that North American wide intelligence, because that's such a big difference. If someone was just thinking, well, I've got this opportunity in Jacksonville, and they're thinking it's going to be Chicago prices to actually improve the land when it actually turns out to be double, that can be a big expense, especially if you're doing 38 acres. That becomes a big number very
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, all of a sudden your budget goes up by $5 million. You'll feel it.
Yeah, you would definitely feel that. What markets are you most bullish on right now, or is it just like anything in that top 30 that checks your boxes?
Well, and listen, anything top 30, but I'll give you some like more, for example, I'll give you some more insight. I really like I like Miami. I like Miami, Orlando, Jacksonville, Savannah, Atlanta, and then moving all up the East Coast, all the major markets. I do like Chicago land a lot. We understand it. I never buy anything Chicago until we get a special exemption on the property taxes. There are two types of exemptions that you can apply for 12 years. Chicago is very risky if you don't understand that the aspect of the game, and the taxes could really escalate and kill your profits or hurt the tenant. So we make sure we get it done before we acquire any asset, and because we've done it for a while, and even prior to doing industrial, with the multifamily and self-storage in Chicago, so we really know the market and the process. So and then but I'll give you an example for, like if you look at West Coast, LA, LA Port, Inland Empire, the rents got up to, $35,000 a month an acre.
Wow.
I would say now they're maybe like at 18,
Hmm.
15 to 18. So, we're willing to buy assets at a realistic price. I believe some of the assets and some of the owners still haven't realized that the rents have deflated and the values have gone. But I'll give you a general way how I think about how I think about markets, and I'll use two markets in the West Coast. Arizona, Phoenix, great market. But then you look at Las Vegas. So I prefer Las Vegas to Phoenix. So Phoenix is a great market, but Phoenix is very wide. And then if you want to go wider, you just reclaim more desert. It's not cheap, right? But you can keep going out and reclaiming more desert. But when you look at Vegas, Vegas is surrounded by mountains. So you can expand. I like being in markets that are either geographically constrained or constrained by some kind of regulation. If you look at Canada, if you look at Toronto or Montreal, and you look at all the green land around the cities, and you're like, oh my goodness, they could keep expanding. But in Canada, it's like impossible, right? So it's impossible to go. So I like some kind of a barrier. So that, if you're adding supply to the market, it's not going to continuously add and become oversupplied.
I think that's great advice for anybody that's listening to that. It reminds me of a saying I heard a long time ago: flat land, flat rent. And the implication on it is exactly as you said. If you can if it's developable land, even if it does take cost to do it, but if there's developable land in every direction, you can just, in theory, keep adding more and more inventory. So that flat land, flat rent has stuck with me for a while, but I like how you described it even better. I want to touch on the Orange County and Los Angeles topic, because they're buried in that story is a deep opposition to new industrial developments, specifically in that area. I think at one point there were 13 counties that had moratoriums on new. Primarily, they were going after the big box warehousing, but there's a growing opposition across North America. It's most prevalent, I think, in California, but I know that there was an area in Chicago that had a community oppose it. In New Jersey, there's areas. When you're looking at a property that isn't zoned for what you're looking to do, and you went through the exercise on one where you were able to rezone it during your conditional period, is that a concern that it's going to be harder and harder to rezone non-industrial land into industrial land so that you can actually get this in the first place when a lot of communities don't want another truck parking lot when it could be land that's used for parks or schools or multifamily or whatever it is. Is that a concern going forward that we just keep seeing more and more pushback on industrial?
I don't see it as a concern. I see it as an opportunity,
Yeah,
right?
that's
It's
kind of what I was hoping you'd say.
it's an opportunity because for those of us who are in the market, who have the right comms, who have the balance sheet and cash flow to keep buying into the market that is constrained, and that's the reason why I went into this market because you have fairly flat supply, and you have demand that keeps rising, and demand is rising for two main reasons, right? Most people want to shop online, whether you like to admit it or not. Even my mother, now since COVID, she's 74, 75. She doesn't want to go buy toilet paper and paper towel. And, she likes shopping for the stuff she likes. She likes going to Sephora,
Mhm.
and trying on makeup, but she doesn't want to go buy, toilet paper, paper towels, all the repetitive stuff at home. She gets it all delivered. So and the younger generation, I didn't want to talk about. So as long as the demand keeps rising, the need for the last mile logistics for the, trucking and delivery sites inside of the cities is going to keep growing. So, and then the second part is Trump's got a lot to do with it. I know he's not everyone's favorite, but the tariffs are starting to push a lot of companies into the United States when it comes to, infill manufacturing. We have a separate bucket of cash for infill manufacturing, and we've been getting calls from Chinese and Canadian manufacturers. They're looking to relocate to the United States. They don't want a big expenditure of buying the asset. They would prefer that we buy the asset, we manage the asset, and they pay us rent, right? And they're willing to sign leases and they're being flexible and they need a real estate expert. So if you're looking at new factories of today, they're not your assembly lines with people pushing two buttons. They're factories with robots and automation. So they cannot be built in a tertiary market with 2,000 people in it. You need to build a factory in the city or really close to the city where people live because you need programmers, you need mechanical engineers, you need robot engineers. You need very few unqualified people. People in factories of today are earning salaries of $100,000 plus because they're qualified. So the space is not only, like you mentioned, it's not only that the space isn't getting zoned, that cities not allowing rezoning, but it's also getting gobbled up. And we see this as a real opportunity, and that's the reason why we went into this business. You have a constrained supply and the demand that keeps rising, which is going to keep driving rents up. I cannot control interest rates, but I do like rents going up.
Yeah, I agreed. For all the reasons you mentioned, that's why I'm bullish and long on industrial in general. I think that there's such a long runway ahead of it. What what it could potentially derail that? What keeps you up at night? What are the risks that perhaps the average person isn't thinking about that could cause a problem? Or do you just think that long term it eradicates any of these short term blips anyways?
I agree with you when you say long term eradicates short term blips. But what I will tell you, well, it doesn't keep me up at night. Our leverage across everything that we own is sub 35%,
Hmm.
right? And our debt service coverage ratio is very good. What would keep me up at night is if I was dealing with an investment where I'm leveraged 70%,
Mhm.
right? Or 65 or 70%, and you have fixed rent for the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years, but your interest rates can fluctuate. Okay. Also, slowdowns in economy. What would keep me up at night if I'm a new investor and I own two assets or one, and one of those assets ends up empty and it takes me a year and a half to lease it. So out of two assets, you have one empty, you have 50% vacancy. It's I used to lose hair over this until we got to a certain amount of assets, but now I don't have to worry about it anymore because I can have 10 assets empty and we're at 3%. So, as a new player in the market, and there are a lot more risks, rather than somebody who's also well established. So I do believe in the long term, industrial is going to keep rising. Some people talk about robotics and drones, but even if you're using drones have to be parked somewhere, they have to be maintained, they have to be serviced. Self-driving trucks are amazing. We own a couple of facilities, where the trucks are charged via electricity, and they're already trained them to be self-driving. That's great. They still have to stop to recharge, right? They still have to be maintained. So you still need facilities. And I believe the world is moving into a world that's more automated, especially with AI. And shopping online is becoming more and more feasible and more accessible. I believe we're probably about 10 years behind China when it comes to that. Chinese, I believe the US e-commerce penetration today, I may be off, is right around 20%. In China, is right around 51 or 52.
Oh,
So yeah.
so still a lot of room to move on that. Yeah,
Correct.
I had a personal story actually on that topic that you mentioned about where you would be stressed. I have a single tenant building, which I guess would actually be considered iOS because it's 15,000 square feet on 4 acres. So it technically, we bought this before iOS was even a term. We had a single tenant building though, and we had a large company that was in there, and last year they gave us notice coming up to their 6 month renewal option that they weren't going to renew. And we looked at the prospect of a large cash call because we do have 65% debt on there. And we were looking at, we got mortgage payment, we got property taxes, we got holding costs, we got all these costs, and we might lose this tenant of all together and lose all that cash flow and have to pay the expenses. And I did lose sleep over it. So we got really lucky. We were able to find another tenant. We had 1 month of downturn and we ended up getting a better rate. So we actually even increased the value of the property. But I was concerned. I did lose sleep over that.
Listen, it makes sense when you own one asset, and that's the reason why, like for us, for myself personally, and for the investors, especially when you look at industrial, the fund strategy makes more sense
Mhm.
because in each fund, and we don't start a new fund until we finish a fund. So in each fund, we own 25, 30 assets, right? So like, let's say in a 30 asset fund, if you have, two properties they're vacant, for a 6 month period or a year period, you have a 6% vacancy. You're like right at the market vacancy. It's not a big deal, right? It doesn't affect your cash flow. So that strategy, and also a lot of our sellers, I didn't mention this, a lot of the sellers will say, hey, I don't want you to have all the upside. I want some of the upside. So what a lot of them do is they do something called a 721 exchange. It's very similar to a 1031. It's actually more advantageous. So let's say we're buying your asset for 5 million and you don't have any mortgage on it, then you say, look, I want 3 million in cash, but I want to roll $2 million into the fund.
Mhm.
Now I no longer own, 100% of this property, but that $2 million is, partial owner of 20 something properties, and it's well diversified. And that money that you roll into the fund, you don't have to pay any tax on because you haven't gotten any cash out of it. So it's very interesting. And also I believe the kids get step up in basis if the person were ever passed. So a lot of advantages. It's called a 721 exchange. Some people also call it an UPREIT
Yeah,
exchange.
that's what I was going to ask, is if
Yeah.
that was similar to an upreit.
It's the same thing.
Okay.
It's the same thing, just two different names for it.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
So if someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, we want to touch base with you, we want to reach out, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
So the best way to get in touch with me is via my email address. It's Ned at 9606capital.com. So Ned at 9606capital.com. If you send me an email, let me know what, if you need help with something. Typically my executive assistant's reading the emails, and what she'll, if you want to sell the property, what she will be able to do is see who would be the best person to handle it, point it to the right department. Even if we're buying an asset, you don't want the first conversation to be with me because I wouldn't know what to say. We typically go, well, it typically goes to a junior analyst
Yeah.
who does the market research, a senior analyst who puts it all together. It goes to, an associate who, approves it, gives the decision, says, hey, we should invest in this property. Here are the reasons why. Usually comes to me, I challenge it, and then that's the point I probably want to have a conversation with somebody rather than, having this blind conversation and making promises I can't live up to.
There's
But we're very quick. Like this whole process happens in like 24 to 72 hours, depending on how busy we are.
The reason I chuckled is I've interviewed Sean Delphin from Delphin Industrial a few times, and he actually used to live in Montreal. But he said the same thing. He's like, if you're talking to me, it's the deal's going to die because it's just the same thing. I don't have the same details as someone going in and actually doing the underwriting, the analysis on it. So if it comes to me, it's probably going to die. So that just made me chuckle how you said that as well. So, well, this was
Sean's a good guy. I know his father. We go to the same synagogue. I run into him in the mornings.
such a
So
small world. Hey.
it's a small world. Yeah.
Well, thanks for this, Ned. I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on this call with me. I got a lot of insights from it, and I just have a lot of respect for yourself and how you're doing business. I think it's a very noble way of doing it, and it's refreshing to hear that more personal side of it instead of just thinking of it as big business that doesn't care. I think you've clearly demonstrated that that's not the case with you and your company. So really do appreciate this. This was a very fun conversation.
I was gonna say thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed talking to you. You're very knowledgeable, especially when it comes to this industry. And I look forward to chatting with you another time.
Yeah, I'd love to. Let's definitely schedule something for the fall. I think it'd be fun to just get a pulse on what happens throughout the next few months in 2025 and see what's going on in the fall.
Amazing. Pleasure talking to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Ned.